Hi, I'm going to start off today talking about the sovereignty of God as we talk about the attributes of God and who He is. One of the major ones in Scripture is God is sovereign. And this is also a subject of much debate. It's a subject of debate in the Calvinist Arminian controversy. And sometimes it's presented as if it's the same battle, but it's also a debate in regard to how God is working in individual lives, and how God is working in evil and wicked people versus righteous people. How do we explain the presence of evil, bad circumstances? And there's various competing views on all of those things. And I will say that Calvinism and Arminianism versus the problem of evil, for example, they're related discussions, but they're not exactly the same. And so that you can't say because somebody is an Arminian that he's going to have this view or this response to the problem of evil. And so when we talk about the sovereignty of God as it relates to the question of salvation, is not the same question as it relates to people in general. And they're related. We can't separate them completely, but they're not identical. And what I'm going to do today is really just introduce this subject. So I'm not going to say probably anything that you want me to talk about today. I'm just going to introduce the subject, kind of give the general biblical lay of the land, and in the weeks ahead start talking about various specific questions related to the sovereignty of God. And before I even get into that, we need to remember there is a range of, I'll say, orthodox or permitted beliefs related to the sovereignty of God. So there are those who would say God is sovereign in that God directs and decrees every event that happens. Good, bad, indifferent, it's all the direct decree of God. It happened because God said, do that. There are those on the other end of the spectrum who say, well, God is sovereign, but in that he, or maybe in the middle of the spectrum, God is sovereign in that He allows certain things to happen. And then on farther over yet would be those who say, well, God is sovereign in that whatever happens, He uses to accomplish His own purposes. He doesn't necessarily specifically permit it, definitely doesn't specifically decree it, but He is ruler over all, so He is able to use whatever happens to accomplish His good purposes. And all three of those are, generally speaking, within the realm of biblical orthodoxy. So that somebody is not denying the faith by saying, well, God works out everything. And they're not denying the faith, well, God decrees everything. It's within the realm of biblical faithfulness, and it really comes down to a question of how are we defining sovereignty. And so even as we start into this, I know I am going to say some things that some people are going to disagree with. And as we're interacting, you're probably going to say things I disagree with. Because this is a challenging subject. And the biblical information that is present in some cases appears contradictory. It's not contradictory, but it appears that way because we don't understand the sovereignty of God well enough. And so I'm not going to try to solve debates in this, nor do I want to stir up debates, even though I'm sure we're going to have some back and forth discussion. I'm not going to try to answer all the questions, but rather to give the biblical framework and work through some, the things that we would say, okay, you can't say that and actually be Christian, or you can't say that and it be accurate biblically. We'll try to chop off the outliers without necessarily trying to deal with the controversial areas within Christianity. And so that just by way of the example, we find godly men on the side of strongly affirming the sovereignty of God in salvation, and that God eternally chose specific individuals that He would save, and then He saved them. And then on the godly men on the other side who would strongly affirm man has a responsibility, an individual saved because he chose to be saved, not because God chose him before the foundation of the world. They're godly men on both sides. And we need to keep those in mind as we think through this discussion, that much of the area of disagreement is within the realm of I would say, application, within the realm of reason and logic, not the realm of revelation. And I'm going to, again, in the weeks ahead, come back and explain a little bit more what I mean by that, too. So right off the bat, let me give you just a simple definition of the sovereignty of God. God is in complete control of all things. It's a simple definition that I'm sure anybody can say, well, what do you mean by complete? What do you mean by control? What do you mean by all? Those are all words that are up for discussion in this conversation. But everybody who affirms the sovereignty of God says that in some way, God is working in the world so that what is accomplished is His desired outcome. And the nature of that working is what's up for debate, but the fact of God's accomplishing His desired outcome, that's not. That's very clearly stated in Scripture, so that we would affirm, and it would have to affirm very strongly, that what is happening in the world is under the control of God and is accomplishing God's good purposes. And how God accomplishes that, again, is a different discussion. But the fact is a biblical truth. And so that Charles Ryrie says God has a plan which is all-inclusive and which he controls. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about the sovereignty of God. God's plan includes everything. And He is controlling the outcome of that plan. Millard Erickson says it simply, God exercises His authority in the universe. That's what we're talking about. God is God. He is the authority. He is the sovereign. He is the ruler, the king. He's the one in charge. Now, we can have, and we certainly see in the human realm, governments abdicating their authority. A king can have the name, but not exercise any of his authority. Rather, not only does God have authority, but what Erickson is saying is that God exercises that authority. He doesn't just possess it, He uses it, so that He is working authoritatively in circumstances in all the universe. And so we see this, for example, in Psalm 103, the Lord has established His throne in heaven, and His kingdom rules over all. That's what we're talking about when we talk about the sovereignty of God, the rule of God over the universe, everything. As we're discussing this is one of the areas of debate, is what about the free will of man? This is why this is such a complex subject, because people say, well, God can't be sovereign in the way that you describe because man is given a free will. And then somebody say, well, man doesn't really have a free will because God is sovereign in the way that I'm describing. And what we have to recognize is we go to the Bible, as the Bible affirms that there is a will in man that is legitimately able to choose and is responsible for the choices it's making. And there's a sovereignty of God in which He does accomplish His good purposes in everything, including every individual. So we cannot understand sovereignty in such a way that we remove the legitimate free will of man And the will of man, that legitimate free will of man, must not be understood in such a way that it dilutes the sovereignty of God. And this is incredibly difficult, if not nearly impossible, by human beings. Because as we wrestle through these questions, we naturally bend one way or the other. So that we begin to emphasize the sovereignty of God so that it limits or removes the free will of man, or we naturally emphasize the will of man so that it actually has the effect of saying, well, God's not quite as sovereign. And so that some have said, and in some of these issues have said, well, God is sovereign over his own sovereignty, which is true. But it's double talk and them saying, yes, God is sovereign, but he has stepped back from wielding his sovereignty in certain cases. For example, in the decisions of men. So that God steps back from man, says, you do what you're going to do, and I'm still going to make it work out. And we cannot just say God, I would say, abdicates his authority or responsibility, and nor can we say that God so works that man's responsibility is not real, that man has no real responsibility, but God does everything. They're both present and affirmed in Scriptures, and so we have to affirm them. And again, that's a big discussion we're going to come back to on its own. So all the questions you may be having, you just have to wait for a few weeks until we get to them. The first thing, though, God is totally sovereign. This is said in so many different passages of Scripture. We see Psalm 135, verse 6, whatever the Lord pleases, he does. In heaven and in earth, in the seas, and in all the deep places. And he does what he wants in heaven, and he does what he wants in the earth. In the deep places, the places where we don't go, we don't see, we don't know what's going on, God is still doing what pleases him. Now, I say God does whatever he wants, and we remind ourselves what we've already talked about of the attributes of God, the character of God. What pleases God to do are those things that are in accord with his changeless character. So we can't read this verse and just saying that God is capricious, he's random and arbitrary in doing whatever he wants. What pleases him is in accord with his character. And it is saying, the psalm is saying, that God does those things which pleases him everywhere. He does his will. We see it in Proverbs chapter 19. There are many plans in a man's heart. Nevertheless, the Lord's counsel, that will stand. So we have here the statement that God's going to do what he planned to do. So we go to our own planning, and all of us have plans. You probably have plans for this week. You may have plans for the 4th of July. And that may or may not happen. Sometimes our plans come about. Often they change. What God plans, and remembering Hebrew poetry here, we're talking a parallel between the first statement and the second statement, so that we have the plans are parallel with counsel, man is parallel with Lord. And so it's saying the Lord's plan is going to stand. God's going to do what God plans to do. Proverbs 21:30 says there's no wisdom or understanding or counsel against the Lord. And so even though we know that this universe is broken by sin, that man in general is an active rebellion against God, that Satan and his demons are violently opposing God always, yet none of those things are successful in interfering with the plan of God. There's nothing that can stop God's plan from happening. Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 11, he has made everything beautiful in its time. That's where I'm going to stop. The verse goes beyond that. But the point there is that God is accomplishing his perfect purposes in the right time. So that comes at the end of, to everything there is a season. That very familiar passage. And then he says there's a time for every purpose under heaven. And God has made everything beautiful in its time. That seasons that we see of change, and as Solomon says, the vanity, it just comes and goes, and it seems random to us. Yet in Ecclesiastes 3, Solomon says, but that God has a purpose that he is accomplishing in all of the apparent randomness. God is accomplishing this perfect, beautiful purpose with all of the various, sometimes ugly pieces. Ephesians chapter 1 says very simply that God works all things according to the counsel of his will. So that everything is worked out. Everything is accomplished. Again, according to the plan that God has determined. The counsel that God has laid out, what he desired to do, is being done. And so when we talk about the sovereignty of God, that's what we're talking about. That's the definition of sovereignty. That God is working out his perfect plan. That in the end, it will all be exactly as he intends it. And so spelling that out and thinking through what the Bible teaches on that, we go through and look at some very specifics of who and what God is sovereign over. Because we say that, and then we might begin to think, well, what about these various examples? So we have, right off the bat, God is sovereign over the angelic creatures. We see this Ezekiel 28. He is speaking of Lucifer, of Satan. He says, you were the anointed cherub who covers. I established you. You were on the holy mountain of God. And goes on and talks about Lucifer there. But what we see is God says to Lucifer, I established you. God put him in that position. Not Lucifer. He didn't come up with that on his own. He was created and put in a specific position and given a role. And the book of Job, we see this very evident, that even after the rebellion of Satan, he remains under the authority of God. And so it says there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. And the Lord said to Satan, from where do you come? So Satan answered the Lord and said, from going to and fro in the earth and from walking back and forth on it. So this is an accounting. This is an evaluation. Satan is coming before God, and God is saying, what have you been up? What have you been doing? It's not a curiosity of what's going on. It's not I don't know what's going on. I want you to tell me. This is a master examining his servant and saying, you tell me, give me an accounting of how you have spent your time. Tell me what you've been doing with your time. He is a servant here. Then the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil? So Satan answered the Lord and said, does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not made a hedge around him, around his household, and around all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. In verse 12, it says, the Lord said to Satan, behold, all that he has is in your power, only do not lay a hand on his presence. There we have Satan coming to God to give account of himself and of his actions. And now Satan he's saying, I can't do anything. I read almost a frustration there. I can't do anything. You won't let me near him. And then God says, okay, fine. You can do this, but you cannot do this. There are very definite restrictions on what Satan can do. And Satan has no choice but to obey this, to obey these restrictions. God is still sovereign, so that Satan, in all of his rebellion, may say, well, no, I want to do this. I'm going to strike him with bulls right now, and I'm going to make him suffer, and we'll kill him all, kill him and everything. But he can't. He can't go beyond the limits set for him. He is chained. He is leashed so that he can go this far and no farther. And God has full control over how much leash he gives him and how little he gives him. And so we see that Satan himself and all the other angels are under God's sovereign control. Psalms tells us that the angels are ministering spirits sent out from him. So the righteous angels are very definitely under the control of God. There's no question about that. But even the rebellious angels are under the sovereign control of God. He is sovereign over all men. And this is one area where we really do struggle in thinking through this. And so I've got more verses here than normal, because the reality is God is sovereign over every man. Acts 17:28, Paul says, in him we live, move, and have our being. So that all of our life is constrained within and by God. Not that it's a pantheistic thing, that the earth is somehow a piece of God, but that under the control and the direction of God is our life lived. Our life is never lived apart from that. We see specific examples. Proverbs 21:1, the king's heart is in the hand of the Lord like the rivers of water. He turns it wherever he wishes. You take the ruler of the nations, those who we deem mightiest, who have the armies to back up their will, who are used to doing what they want to do. And God turns it like a irrigation channel is actually the picture. The rivers of water. It's an irrigation channel. He lays it out. He diverts the water there. He diverts the water there. He puts it exactly where he wants it, even in the mightiest of men. So that we reason from the greater to the lesser. We start with the mightiest people. And if the mightiest one is in the hand of God, how much so those who are lesser, who in the day-to-day affairs don't have the authority to rule their own life, who are under all kinds of other constraints, who do not have armies to back up their will. But God turns the heart of every man wherever he wishes. Ezra chapter 1, give you one example of this. In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that we have a specific example of a king who is being turned to do the will of God. We can see the same Isaiah 44, Isaiah 45, prophesying of Cyrus. God says of him, he is my shepherd, he will perform all my pleasure. Cyrus, before he was ever born, before Persia ever ruled the Middle East, God picked out Cyrus and said, he's going to do what I want. He is going to specifically build the temple and the foundation of Jerusalem. He is that much in control. Isaiah 45:13, I've raised him up in righteousness, still talking about Cyrus, in fact. And he says, I will direct all his way. He shall build my city and let my exiles go free, not for price nor reward. So again, God is simply in control. Romans chapter 9, we see this with Pharaoh. God says, I've raised you up that I may show my power in you. I can keep multiplying examples on kings, but specifically individuals. Psalm 139, David says, your eyes saw my substance being yet unformed, and in your book they all were written. The days were fashioned for me, when as yet there was none of them. So he's saying in God's book, all of David's days were fashioned. Before there was a single day for David, his days were laid out in the plan of God. So that we see in the life of a specific individual, God is sovereign over every day. He is sovereign over nations. So he's sovereign over all men, sovereign over men individually, sovereign over all the nations of the world. Psalm 22:28, the kingdom is the Lord's and he rules over the nations. I mean, how much more plain can that be? He rules over all the nations. Paul says the same thing, Acts 17:26. He has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on the face of the earth and has determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings. Think about that. God has determined the times of the nations, of every nation. So you're talking about the Roman Empire, when it began and when it ended. We don't even know when the Roman Empire ended. We debate whether it ended in 400 something BC or 1400 and or 400 and something AD or 1400 and something AD. We debate all of these things. Can't even fully answer the questions. But God has a predetermined time. He knew the beginning of America as the United States of America. He knows the end of it. He also determines the boundaries so that we can legitimately say America stretches from the Atlantic to the Pacific as it does because God has appointed it to do so. And also we can legitimately say that Russia goes from the Pacific to I think it's the North Sea, there, from ocean to sea, across the north as it does, because God has appointed it to do so. And that the Iron Curtain fell exactly when God appointed it to fall. There have been revolutions and revolts and coups exactly according to the timing that God has determined. That's what he's saying. That God has established the nations, their length of time, the boundaries, how large they are. He has established all of that. He has determined it. So he is sovereign over the nations. He is sovereign over nature. And I really wanted to read long passages here. I point you to Psalm 104 because that's all it is. A whole big description of God's sovereignty over nature. Job 37, 38, and 39, Job is asked by God, are you sovereign over nature? I mean, that's the gist of it. 70-something questions that God asks Job. Are you in charge? Are you in charge of the goats? Are you in charge of the things in the ocean? Are you in charge of the horses? Are you in charge of the sun? Are you in charge of the moon? Are you in charge of the stars? Are you in charge of the snow? What are you in charge of, Job? Exactly. You tell me. And they're all rhetorical questions because the answer is no, I'm not in charge. God's in charge. He's sovereign over all of nature. So we see Jeremiah 10, when he utters his voice, there's a multitude of waters in the heavens. And he causes the vapors to ascend from the ends of the earth. He makes lightning for the rain. He brings the wind out of his treasury. So we saw storms come through last night. I know some people had some thunderstorms anyway. The wind's been blowing like crazy. We've had rains and storm like we haven't had for a while in the UP. Or we've had rains. I wouldn't call them storms, but we've had rains like we haven't had for a while in the UP. And they're all because of the command of God. It's all because of his command. We see this in Nahum. The Lord is slow to anger and great in power, will not at all acquit the wicked. The Lord has his way in the whirlwind and in the storm. I mean, what is to our eyes more chaotic and out of control than a tornado? And yet God directs that. He accomplishes his purposes in that. Are not two sparrows sold for a copper coin, and not one of them falls to the ground apart from your Father's will? I mean, there's no seemingly more valueless bird. Certainly in that culture, there was no more valueless bird. And yet God says that every one of them is under the sovereign control of God. Every single one of them. He's sovereign over nature. He is sovereign over chance. Literally, the roll of the dice. The lot is cast into the lap, but every decision is from the Lord. I mean, how much more plain is that? Man, and especially in that culture, they would cast their lots to make a decision. They would seek the wisdom from the bones or the runes or whatever it was that they were reading, and yet all of that seemingly randomness was from the Lord. Every decision is from his hand. And he's sovereign in preservation and keeping these things going, keeping the world running. Nehemiah 9 says, you alone are the Lord. You have made heaven, the heaven of heavens, with all their hosts, the earth and everything on them, the seas and all that is in them. It encompasses creation. You've made it all. And you preserve them all. God keeps it all together. See the same thing in Colossians chapter 1, speaking of Jesus. In him all things consist. Hebrews chapter 1, that he is the one who upholds all things by the word of his power. So we talk about the sovereignty of God. We're not just talking about the sovereignty of God, in events, but in the continuance of creation. That God is actively sustaining everything. So that this moment is here because God has actively sustained and continues to sustain it. And God has sovereignly said, the world's going to continue. And we'll keep holding it all together. He is actively sustaining all things. Very briefly, I've already alluded to this, but one of the reasons this is so important, as Charles Hodge said, this sovereignty of God is the ground of peace and confidence to all his people. What it comes down to is God is in charge. So that however we define that nature of his in charge, we all end up saying God is sovereignly in charge so that he is accomplishing his purposes. All things, we know all things work together for good to them who love God. If God's not sovereign, we can't say that. If somebody else is accomplishing their will as well, if somebody else gets to get things done and ultimately have their end accomplished, we can't say that with certainty God is always in every situation working all things out for good. But because God is sovereign, because he rules over all events, we can say that, yes, I don't understand the good purposes right now. I don't see how they're happening and how they're going to make sense. But I know that God is in charge. And I can have peace, and I can have confidence in these events because God still rules. He's still doing and accomplishing his plan. And his plan is wise. His plan is good. His plan is just. Because that's what he is. He is good, wise, and just. And so I can rest in that because God is the one whose plan will stand and be accomplished.